Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you please take your seats? If I can ask you all to take a seat, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to everyone here today, both those of you in the room and those of us who are joining via the live stream. As I learned this morning, and as they say in the Pacific, all protocols observed. We won't single anyone out for particular mention except our guest speakers shortly. We welcome all of you in celebrating today. Attendees today come from many different places, many from unceded First Nations land across Australia. In the City of Melbourne, we respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And as the Dean of the Law School, we also, on these occasions, acknowledge that the people of the Kulin Nations and the Indigenous people in Australia have the world's oldest continuing jurisprudential tradition. Just a short safety announcement. In the unlikely event of an emergency, exits are located at the back. I should be doing that, shouldn't I? And in front of the room. Please look to the RACV staff who will assist your evacuation. Today's International Women's Day breakfast is a collaboration between Monash Law, Monash Arts and Monash Business School. And we are joined by each of their deans today. I'm Brian Horrigan, the Dean of the Law School. We have Professor Sharon Pickering, the Dean of the Monash Arts, and Professor Simon Wilkie, Head of the Monash Business School and Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics. We're also joined by another of our decanal colleagues, the Dean of Engineering, Professor Elizabeth Croft. Monash Law is proud to be associated with this event and of the achievements of our women alumni and those who are associated with Monash Law. It was Professor Enid Campbell, whose name is remembered every time we walk past one of the halls of residence at Monash in Campbell Hall. It was Professor Enid Campbell, who was Australia's first law professor, and then Australia's first female law professor, and Australia's first female law dean, and the first female Chief Justice of Victoria, or I think any jurisdiction in Australia, is now with the university as a Vice-Chancellor's Professorial Fellow, Professor the Honourable Marilyn Warren, who is also another of our alumni. On International Women's Day 2021, Monash University is proud to present three of our esteemed Monash alumni who are standout women of influence. They are three women who are tackling global challenges, and the Vice-Chancellor has set a challenge for the university for the next 10 years to also be examining and doing research and education directed towards the grand challenges of the age. From climate change to gender equality and the business benefits of cultural diversity, we'll learn today how these three women are making meaningful changes in our world, and we thank them for joining us and being willing to share their insights with us. The Honourable Dr. Sharman Stone, Amanda McKenzie and Div Pillay in joining us today. It is now my great pleasure to stand aside and to invite the Dean of the Monash Arts Faculty, Professor Sharon Pickering, to the stage.
Good morning. I would like to thank my very good colleague, the Dean of Law, for his welcome, and I too pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, to their elders, past and present, and I particularly acknowledge Indigenous women on this International Women's Day celebration for your work, for your efforts, for everything. I thank Brian and I also thank Simon for their leadership. We need male leaders who stand up. We need male leaders who know the average reporting time for sexual abuse is 30 years. That is normal. We need male leaders who understand the debilitating personal and professional impact of gender-based violence. We need male leaders who see past incremental change and recognise that it is not just about processes and systems, it is about culture and it's about behaviour. We need male leaders that stand up with actions and words. Let me extend my warmest welcome to you all, our colleagues, our valued alumni and our guests. This was the last time we were together last year before we got sent into COVID lockdown, and it is so good that this is the event that brings us back together again, and thank goodness it has, because we need to be brought back together again at this moment as champions for women, as champions for change. This is a very special day on our calendar at Monash. It is a very special event, and to be perfectly honest with you, it is my favourite event of the year. It's not a competition, but it wins by a country mile. International Women's Day is meant to be a day of celebration. I've tried my best. I've worn pink. I should have worn red so I could be as angry on the outside as I am on the inside. I could have worn black as a sign of mourning for what we have watched, or for me it would have been a deep navy with a court heel. We are meant today to be recognising the great strides we have made towards gender equality, and we have. Today is meant to be about recognising and championing women, to mobilise and propel women to lead, not just women of a particular background, all women. The energies of the last few weeks are now rightly trained on this week and this most timely International Women's Day. The last few weeks have been fraught. This International Women's Day across Australia is about far more than celebration. It is likely for many to be at very least a turning point. However, for most of us, certainly for myself, I believe it is a reckoning. I have been a feminist for as long as I can remember. Being a feminist is who I am. I grew up spending every non-school hour in my father's panel beating garage. I would lie in wait until the spray painter knocked off and left. And I would then go down to the back of the garage. I would open the cupboards that he stored his tins of paint in, and I would rip down the page 3 girls that he stuck inside those cupboard doors. I did it every day that I was there. In every school hour I had when I was in grade 6, I convinced my teacher to let me go to the library because all I wanted to do was read about the suffragettes and the Pankhursts. I have been a feminist for 40 years, and I have not been a feminist for 40 years for the last few weeks. Not for this week, not for the past month that we have witnessed. Why is it so difficult for leaders to recognise that gender-based violence, inclusive of sexual harassment, is about power and it's insidious and structural abuse? And that power is not operated exclusive to gender. Why is it so difficult to recognise that to fundamentally change, we will need to see leadership come from many places simultaneously? The burden, as Grace Tame has so eloquently argued, should not be left on the shoulders of victim survivors. This is a collective burden. This is a collective responsibility. This is a collective mandate for change. Our three panellists today embody this determination and have been fearless in naming the problems, naming big problems, and demanding more comprehensive and more inclusive change. They are bringing together the theme of Choose to Challenge with the United Nations Women Global International Women's Day theme of Women in Leadership, achieving an equal future in a COVID-19 world. We are going to be taking questions at the end of the panellist sessions. We're going to be doing a bit of a, Q&A Ellen DeGeneres thing here. So you'll get to put questions in on Slido, so everyone who's technologically competent can get busy. And that is most excellent. I very much welcome and thank you all for being here. I thank you all for stepping forward into this moment, and I particularly thank our three panellists. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Sharman Stone. Sharman is a Professor of Practice in Politics and International Relations. She is the Foundation Patron of the Monash University Centre for Gender, Peace and Security, and she was, of course, Australia's Global Ambassador for Women and Girls between 2017 and 2020. Prior to this, she was the federal member for Murray, holding various portfolios between 1996 and 2016. Sharman is well known and a long-standing activist for gender equality and interrace relations in Australia and internationally. She has been a champion and reformer of women's sexual and reproductive health rights, Indigenous, rural women's and prisoners' rights. As Ambassador for Women and Girls, she represented Australia's positions on human rights in the United Nations and the Human Rights Committee, while working across the Indo-Asia Pacific to reduce poverty, to better protect unregulated migrants, to eliminate human trafficking and child marriage. Sharman is an alumna of Monash Arts and the Monash Business School, having graduated from an honours degree in the Bachelor of Arts and a PhD. It is just a pleasure to invite Sharman to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of Australia, our Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, and acknowledge that we stand on the land that we took. And there's a lot of work we need to do to make that right. And of course, it's International Women's Day, almost. Let me also say, all protocols observed. Anna and I know that that's the easy way, not to have to relist all of the important people who are here today, which of course includes all 200 of our alumni here. Now let me say that for the last probably decade or so that I was in Parliament, I was particularly active in the Australian chapter of the Asia Pacific Parliamentarians for Population Development. It was funded by Japan and Australia, and it took like-minded MPs from across Asia Pacific to various countries' parliaments to really try and deal with the wicked problems of our region, some of those that Dean Sharon just listed. I'll never forget, we're in Nepal. Nepal had a horrendous problem of child marriage, and they were saying, their MPs, to the rest of us MPs, what are we going to do? We've just raised the age of marriage to 21. It's not legal to be married under 21. But since we don't register births, deaths and marriages, it's kind of being hard to implement. What can we do? And one of our MPs, women MPs there from Bangladesh, said, I want to tell you a story about how it can be done. She explained that about late 1880s, the British new governor arrived to what is now Bangladesh. He immediately observed the burning of widows on the funeral pyres of their husbands. Sati, it was called. And this British governor was a bit distressed by that. He said, that's uncivilised, that's disgusting, that's dreadful. it should stop immediately. He made a few laws about it. He said, this has got to stop. He talked to the faith leaders, he talked to the Brahmins, he talked to everybody. He said, pointed to the law, he said, you can't do this anymore. And they all said, listen, this is a cultural practice that's gone back hundreds of generations. It's none of your business. The widows don't seem to mind. You know, we're getting on with it. So he then issued loudly and clearly a decree. He said, any persons facilitating, participating in, or even observing the burning of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres will be shot. End of story. They will be shot. And I have firing squads at the ready. Guess what? Sati ended in that part of the world. So I'm saying we've got a crisis in Australia right now. It's been rumbling on, in fact, this crisis, well known to people like Anna, also a recovering politician, for a very long time. There is a crisis of confidence in our Parliament, in our Government of Australia. Ordinary men and women are being shocked and disgusted by what they're seeing and hearing about the bullying, the lack of transparency, the alleged criminal behaviour, the lack of inclusion, the men commanding the heights in that establishment seeming to be oblivious in their command and control of the parliamentary process, despite us at this point in time in Australia's history never before needing to have bipartisan, inclusive government to deal with the pandemic, climate change, the Indigenous distress in this country, the growing inequalities, the urban-rural divide, which grows exponentially all of the time. Never before have we needed inclusive, proactive, innovative, world best practice governance in our parliamentary democracy, and we have got a crisis of the reverse confronting us. So what is going to be the bullet that changes the ongoing culture, toxic culture of our parliament, our federal parliament? What's going to be the big change? Because I tell you what, I've been here before. I was in Parliament 20 years. I've made allegations. My fellow parliamentary women have made allegations. Our staff have made allegations, like you're hearing now, for 20 plus years. You had that 7:30 report recently, which described in detail the performance and behaviour of several men who are still holding their positions. Nothing to see here. We have 5 inquiries as we speak in Parliament. I think most of us at this point imagine, oh yeah, they'll finish, they'll be tucked away, business as usual, probably. Can't let it happen anymore, can we? Because our very parliamentary democracy is at stake, and the governing of Australia as a fair, just, equitable, safe, peaceful place is at stake. So, here's the bullet. Every woman and man sitting in this room has to say to themselves, I'm not just going to tweet, I'm not just going to retweet and think I've done the job. I'm not just going to read the papers online and be disgusted. I'm going to seriously stand up at the next election and challenge the incumbent. I might go as an independent, you might think, or I might join a party, or I might form a new party, but I'm going to challenge the status quo. I'm going to call out the behaviour, the lack of inclusion, the gendered politics that are now in Parliament by standing myself. And I'm going to support others if I think for some reason I can't do it, who share my convictions. I'm going to help them stand for Parliament, because the only thing that is going to stop this behaviour in Parliament is when the current parliamentarians think their seat, their power, is under threat. All right? So at the moment, think of the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, wondering what to do with this allegation against his most senior lawmaker. He knows that if that most senior lawmaker says, listen, PM, I'm over it, I'm going to go to the crossbenches, He no longer is Prime Minister of Australia, pretty much, because the numbers are gone. So how are we going to disturb that? We've got to disturb that by the whole of the Australian constituency rising up and saying no more. And those people who rise up have got to demand quotas in Parliament so that we've got at least 50% women. Every party has got to have quotas. The Labor Party has been doing this for a while. So have the Liberals and National Party, the Greens, a whole lot have got to say 50% of our participants in the campaign and our winners of the seats, not just marginal seats, will be women. We've got to be saying that the actual length of Parliament, the 3 years, has got to be changed to 4 to 5 years, and the new incumbents of the place will insist through maybe a referendum that the length of Parliament changes. We're going to have those new parliamentarians say, enough, we are not going to sit those parliamentarians for 12 to 14 hours a day doing dysfunctional, mostly useless behaviours and activities like duplicating committees. So you've got the same committee in Reps and Senate coming up with 47 recommendations that the ministers of the day do not have to deal with, just to keep us busy. We're going to abolish question time as it currently stands because it's misogynist, it rewards masculine behaviours which imply that if you're not strong, loud, confronting, abusive, you're not across your portfolio. That will be gone by New Zealand-style question time. You're going to have sittings no more than 3 days a week. They're going to sit from 9 till 5:30, so women with children and men who care for children can participate in the Parliament. You're going to have staff employed independently, all of them, by an independent human resources department which is going to be mirroring corporate Australia. Every job in Parliament House, minister, shadow minister, committee, office bearer, every one of those jobs has to be advertised in print, online, so that all of the current secrecy, who's in the know about a reshuffle, who knows whom, that goes. It's got to be open, transparent. All of that has to change. We've got to put caps on campaign funding. No foreign funding for campaigns in Australia. There's a long list of what we have to do, but we've got to begin by men and women of Australia, but particularly us women, standing up and saying, we're over it. The bullet, the firing squad that's going to change our current direction for all time is going to be replacing the current incumbencies. That's the only way we're going to get change. But it takes all of us to get up and into it, to sacrifice our own personal time and space and current career trajectories. We're going to put our own hands up, or we're going to support others who put their hands up, and we're going to start campaigning pretty soon because there's an election in the next 18 months, and we're going to challenge and campaign on having a more inclusive, participatory, parliamentary democracy which says no to misogyny, bullying, secret men's business, the boys' club, that says no, it will be participatory and inclusive. We can do it. There are examples of parliaments like that around us. Not many, but there are a few. We'll also have separate seats guaranteed for Indigenous Australians, like New Zealand does with its Māoris. So, everybody, that's what we've got to do. Otherwise, yeah, we'll have a bit more titillation in the media. People like Brittany and Grace and that poor anonymous woman who took her life in Adelaide last June. Otherwise, their efforts will just be another little bit of media entertainment for a week or so, and it'll roll on. So it's time. Choose to challenge, everybody. We have the very good fortune in this room to have had an elite education as alumni of Monash. We have been educated to be very well informed, to have a conscience, to be great Australians. So Can I challenge you? Can I ask you to choose to challenge and start thinking about that next campaign? You've got to be in it. Thank you.
Brilliant, you make me cry. Thank you so much, Sharman, and I look out on a room of incredibly talented champions, and I am sure there are many in their number who are ready. It is now absolutely my pleasure to introduce Amanda McKenzie, CEO at the Climate Council. Amanda is one of the best-known public commentators on the climate crisis in Australia. She is CEO and co-founder of the Climate Council, an independent climate change education and advocacy body. Previously, Amanda co-founded the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and has served on renewable energy expert panels for the Queensland and Northern Territory governments. Amanda was the founding chair of the Centre for Australian Progress and is a former board director at Plan International Australia and the Whitlam Institute. Amanda has won numerous awards, including being recognised as one of Westpac's 100 Women of Influence and a finalist in the Telstra Young Businesswoman of the Year Awards. Amanda is an alumni from the Faculty of Law and holds an honours degree in law. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you for that really warm welcome. It's really lovely to be here. I don't know about you, but this is the first time I've been up before 7 a.m. going somewhere in the world for a year. And it's so nice to be in a room full of people with no masks. It feels a little bit normal in what has already been described as quite a dramatic couple of weeks, which I think has been very triggering and rageful for many of us. I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we meet and acknowledge that that land has never been ceded and that that is one of the big feminist issues for all of us as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience in working on climate change with women and both the disproportionate impacts that women experience, but also the women leaders that I see emerging here and right around the world that are doing such good work. And then end on a bit about the spirit of International Women's Day. So climate change, as you know, is happening all around us. We all experienced that in the last summer bushfires, where 80% of Australians experienced some form of smoke inhalation. That smoke inhalation also had a disproportionate impact on women, particularly women that were bearing children, for instance. There's now a lot of research coming out of different areas about women having, for instance, smokers-type placentas from breathing in that smoke for long periods of time when their babies have been born. This is one of those issues that the smoke inhalation actually goes on for years in terms of what the impacts will be. And of course, many people lost their lives, people lost their livelihoods and communities when those bushfires were burning. The climate impacts are right around us today. I remember when I started working in climate change 15 years ago, we talked about climate change as a future issue. Well, it's absolutely here with us now, and the crisis will impact women disproportionately. Women around the world are more likely to live in poverty. 1.3 billion people live in poverty and 70% of them are women. So when you have the least resources to cope with any sort of disruption, you're bound to be more impacted by it. Women do 80% of the world's work in food production and own only 10% of the land, which gives you a sense of the connection that women have with the land globally, with nature and the systems that are being disrupted, but also their agency in how they respond to something like climate change when there are natural disasters. And I think we can often, in Australia, think that some of those, that vulnerability is only a global issue for poor women around the world. But it's true here as well. We look at the impact that COVID had on women, and it disproportionately impacted women across the board in a whole range of different ways. So because women have less agency and less power, less wealth, we're more vulnerable to disasters that occur. So that said though, in my experience working on climate change now, as I said, for 15 years, It's been remarkable to see women stepping up here and around the world to take ownership of the issue and say, we're not going to let this get away from us, we're going to protect our communities. And I wanted to talk about a number of different women that I think are really embodying different sorts of leadership styles that are really changing the dial on climate change. And when I started working in climate change 15 years ago, I remember going to my first sort of meeting of all of the not-for-profits on climate change, and I was the only woman. And consistently in those spaces, whether they were political, whether they were policy, whether they were science, it tended to be much more male-dominated. That's really shifted in the last few years, and I think it's brought a different spirit of leadership to the climate change challenge. So a few examples. One is Amanda Carhill, who runs an organisation called Next Economy up in Queensland. She brings a real style of empathetic leadership. She said, you know, I can see that there's a range of different coal communities that are thinking, this issue will disrupt my industry and it will disrupt the future jobs in our community. I don't want to get involved in that issue. I'm more tending towards denial than agency. So she's gone and listened. She's gone into these communities and said, I want to hear from you. What is the future you would like for your kids, for your job, for your community? And through that process, she's done a really deliberative work in documenting what people would like to see. And it turns out that they're not wedded necessarily to a coal job. Work down in mines find it distressing because it's affecting their health. Actually, they're wedded to having a job and having a community. And having a community that is safer and healthier is very desirable. So she's done some great work in Queensland and actually bringing communities along the journey. Another example is leadership from behind. We've got an initiative in the Climate Council called the Climate Media Centre, set up by a number of young women. And this was started 5 years ago when we looked at the media landscape and said, you know, it's very technical, it's very political, and it's very policy heavy, and that's not going to relate to most people. So the Climate Media Centre went out and worked with farmers, doctors, solar installers, firefighters, people who are on the front line of both the problem and the solution, and started getting them into the media to hear their stories. Because as it turns out, most farmers actually care about climate change. It might not be in the language that we might use, but they are seeing changes on their land. Firefighters care about climate change. It's, you know, they're out there fighting fires and they're seeing them change. Again, the language might be different, but the sentiment is the same. So the Media Centre now gets 20,000 articles a year on the climate crisis, but through a different lens, connecting to new audiences and making it relevant for their lives. Another fantastic woman who's been leading the charge on climate change globally that you probably heard of is Christiana Figueres. She was one of the key orchestrators behind the Paris Agreement, and the real innovation she brought was bringing collaboration and listening, thinking about how to reorientate a global agreement from being very top-down to much more bottom-up, and listening to what countries would need to make the commitments that they then, in fact, made in Paris. She was enormously successful at bringing people together. She brought a fair degree of charm as well, which definitely helped too. Another leader who's brought another dimension, excuse me, is Jo Dodds, who started a group called Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action. So she had seen the impact on her communities and other communities of bushfires. She thought we need to tell the human story to make people realise why this really matters. So she's been doing an amazing job of connecting to bushfire survivors right around Australia and finding ways for them to speak out publicly about the impact on them and their families. And just to mention one more person, there's so many, but Millie Telford, who runs a group called SEED, which is an Indigenous youth climate activism organisation. And I mention Millie because she's incredibly brave. SEED is a small organisation, but it's out there taking on the big fossil fuel companies, trying to prevent massive expansion in the Northern Territory and other places of gas in particular. Gas is a fossil fuel. It's very polluting. It's often viewed as benign, but it is very substantially polluting. And the sort of basins we have in Australia for gas are absolutely enormous and could totally offset any benefits we have of going towards renewable energy domestically. So Millie and her team of young Indigenous, powerful women are out mobilising traditional owners across the Northern Territory to prevent these projects going ahead. So all of those women, to me, embody a different type of leadership than I was seeing on climate change 15 years ago. I think it is inclusive, I think it's bringing people together, And I think it's finding ways to tackle the problem in ways that is very empowering for communities. And finally, I just wanted to mention the spirit of International Women's Day. Like many of you, I've been watching in horrified the events in Parliament, and particularly the reaction to see Scott Morrison and Christian Porter say, I didn't read the documents, I didn't read the letters, just filled me with absolute rage to think that this, we need to believe survivors, we need to believe women, we need to listen to women, and to not even have opened the letter. And then to have Angus Campbell, the Chief of Defence, telling women that they need to stay inside and, you know, not be attractive as ways to prevent sexual assault. Just like, where are we? Are we in 2021? Like, who are you people? Like, get with the program. That's just not how the world is working now. And women have had this sort of primal scream since Me Too of saying, this has been going on for years and we're not going to put up with it anymore. But it hasn't been adequately heard through the, clearly through the halls of federal parliament. And I looked up International Women's Day because I was feeling a bit despairing and despondent, thinking, what could I say about it at this moment? And one of the first images that came up was Emmeline Pankhurst being arrested for being protesting in part of the suffragette movement, and saying, you know, we need to have the vote. And she was arrested for that protest at the time. And that sort of phrase, the choose to challenge, kind of resonated with me in that way, that social change is hard, it takes a lot of time, and wresting control from the power holders is enormously difficult. And we need to be ready to back up people like Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame, the women who've been so courageous in putting their story forward. And, you know, the impact of those women's lives is just absolutely immense, from what happened originally in terms of the violence, but then also their capacity to step out and be in front of everyone and have the conversation. So it's up to us to stand with them and back them. So I've been thinking about what this moment demands of all of us, and I think it's to channel that rage that Emmeline Pankhurst and so many other women throughout history have channeled, and say, we're not putting up with it anymore, wherever it is in our society. And as others have said, we're not going to let these issues just fade away again. We're going to keep pushing and pushing. And I say this standing here being 34 weeks pregnant, and there's a special type of rage that comes to you when you're pregnant, I think, that maybe some of you can relate to. That's, you're thinking, I'm creating this like next generation. I'm like, it makes you feel, well, for me anyway, feel quite powerful in some moments when I'm not feeling exhausted. And I remember the birth of my first child. I had this amazing moment in labour where I felt like I was connecting to women through the ages, their power and their strength, and saying, you can do it. It kind of just came to me, this feeling when I was feeling quite like, oh, how am I going to do this in labour? And I remembered that when I was looking at Emmeline Pankhurst and thinking about the courage and the strength of women that have gone before us. And that this is the moment to channel that strength, channel that persistence, and say, we'll never give up. We're going to make it better for the kids that are coming after us. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I think you were much more lucid and much more connected during childbirth than I certainly was. It is now a pleasure to introduce Div Pillay, who is CEO at Mind Tribes. Born in South Africa, Div was raised and educated under apartheid. She migrated to Australia in 2002, and in 2012, she co-founded Mind Tribes to drive the business benefits of racial and cultural diversity and inclusion in workplaces. Mind Tribes makes inclusion matter to both individuals and organisations, and in just 7 years, Mind Tribes has grown into an award-winning business, including recognition in Westpac's 2018 Businesses of Tomorrow. Div featured in the 2018-19 Australian Financial Review 100 Women of Influence list, and was most recently a judge of the Telstra Business Women's Awards. She is an alumna of Monash Business School and holds a Masters of Human Resource Management. A very warm welcome, Div.
Wow, it's wonderful to see an audience. Yesterday I spoke to 668 people from SEEK and I could just see myself because they put everybody's cameras off. So it's wonderful to see all of you. And many faces I recognize. So I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and paying my respects, my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging. My commitment as a diversity and inclusion consultant is to never do business with a client who doesn't have a reconciliation action plan that is committed and meaningful. So we play big, even though we're small. I want to thank Monash for inviting me today, particularly Monash Business School. The Monash Business School has always supported me in owning my own agency and having my own voice. So I love that about that backing. They've given me confidence when sometimes I didn't believe in myself. So my MBA studies and my Masters in HR were just moments that were poignant moments for me. Now, my purpose today is to raise a spotlight on gender equality from an intersectional perspective. And I'm really going to question you and challenge you about whether you are really lifting gender equality for all women. And the intersection of gender that I'm going to talk about is the intersection of race, of culture, because this is my story. And this is my life's work. Because while I recognize that gender has many other intersections of age, diversity, diverse abilities, and many other cross-sections, this is a moment in time that we all need to recognize that we are really not pushing for progress for all women. When we look at our corporate Australia, when we look at our public sector, even portfolios that are deemed to serve the community that is multicultural, we are still quite white in Australia. So I want to talk to you about my time and my reflections walking in my shoes for 8 years, and I want you to invite you into that journey because I'm going to share little snippets and I want you to feel with me and I want you to think with me, and then I'm going to choose you to challenge yourself and act, because I think intersectional feminism is a challenge of our times in Australia. And with all that's going on, I mean, the previous two speakers spoke about the horrendous weeks that we've seen in Parliament, and I wonder about that power and what a culturally diverse woman or a woman of color would do in that power struggle, because we are way, way down in the food chain when it comes to standing up to that kind of power. So I'm going to share with you some consistent messages I've heard from 2013 to 2017 from CEOs, from heads of people and culture, from diversity and inclusion executives, most of them Anglo and European descent, bar one or two who were people of color. These are hundreds and hundreds of conversations over the last 8 years where I've been introducing intersectional feminism. The cross-section of culture, race, and gender just wasn't palatable in 2012. And here's some of the things I've heard. And before I crack on into those statements, I want to make sure that these statements are not to provoke you if you are from an Anglo or an European descent, but it's just to open your mind to walk in my shoes for a little bit. So here are some of the comments I get when raising people who are in charge of diversity and inclusion and in charge of gender equity programs in the public and private sector. And I want you to think how it would make you feel if you heard this. Do you have to refer to Anglo-Saxon, European, women of color and CALD women? Isn't this in itself divisive? We are concentrating on gender first. Cultural diversity seems too complex. We are not yet ready. The next pillar of our gender conversation is connecting around sexual orientation and the LGBTI community. And that's a natural progression for us, not yet for cultural diversity. We are already very multicultural. Our staff speak about 80+ languages. We don't have the data yet on cultural diversity. Gender's easy, we can count that. Cultural diversity is too hard. It hasn't come up in our engagement survey. I'm not sure whether this is a real area of interest. Can you do a session on cultural competence or anti-racism? We already do work as part of our Reconciliation Action Plan with First Nations women. We do International Women's Day and we do Harmony Week as well. I am colorblind. I don't see color at all. Just be patient. Just as the gender movement evolved, so too will cultural diversity. So I wonder, how do you feel hearing this? Well, back then, in 2012, 2013, I was really frustrated. I was tired. And I still am a little bit. But I've channeled, just like your anger and your rage, I've channeled that frustration and that fatigue to get me out of my funk and fill me up and fuel me to keep going, to make the change that I want to see. I chose to let these comments challenge me to act because I believe that all women deserve to be included, especially in leadership. So I decided in 2017 to start our social enterprise for culturally diverse women, to create a community where First Nations women, migrant professional women from different racial and cultural backgrounds could work together with carefully selected allies and advocates to navigate these sentiments in their organization, which was effectively telling them to wait. 363 women have come through our doors, and 73% of them have had tangible advancement, nowhere near where their potential really sits, but a movement nonetheless. These movements of their upward trajectories have really changed how they are perceived by their allies and advocates and by their organization. And for me, that's a change movement. The problem overall is that it is too slow. The waiting has created low to no representation of these women in C-suite roles, in executive director or director roles across different sectors. And I have invited with me today 3 senior women of color who are first and have been first for a very long time. So at my table number 2 is Sadhna Smiles, first and only CEO in property. Just think about that for a moment. First and only CEO in property, woman of color. Cynthia Chung, one of the very few as head of procurement in food and retail. She's a Monash alumni. Very few women of Asian descent. Zione Intenda Walker, the first and only executive of color in a multicultural portfolio in government. And this is a portfolio that's about multiculturalism and social cohesion in our communities. And they are still led by department secretaries and senior executives that do not look like the communities that they serve. And congratulations to Zione, she's moving on to another role, so I think there's no body of color leading that multicultural portfolio. Now I invite you to connect with these women to hear their stories. I can tell you that they don't want to be the first and the only forever. And I don't want to use our children as a reason why we should change, but all of us have children, these women of color and myself, some of them adults, some of them young, and they can't wait to see when these significant changes will hit them, because my son is 18 and he's off to university this year, and I tell him he can do anything. He can be whatever he wants to be, and I tell my daughters they can do whatever they want to do. They can choose science, they can choose engineering, they can choose maths. But what am I really telling them when I know when they hit the workplace with a name like Nivani or a name like Yashika, that they potentially will face real barriers, because the change has been so slow in my lifetime. So my challenge to you is identify where women of color sit in your business. Are they clustering around the middle in specialist roles? How far from the top are they? Consider how you find out safely what the lived experience is of these women at different levels. And I say safely because there's nothing worse than being surveyed about your lived experience as a woman of color and then nothing gets done. So I would suggest, if you're an Anglo or European leader, I would go to a trusted woman of color to facilitate that conversation. And once you know what that lived experience is, walk in their shoes for a bit. Don't judge someone's experience as to whether it is real or not. If you are stuck for this understanding of lived experience and you can't quite get to have those conversations, I ask you to listen to Sadhana Smiles and my podcast, Business in Color. We have some amazing women of color who share their experience with us, and fantastic advocates and allies who are making change for these women. So back to walking in my shoes. Fast forward to 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, the truth about the disproportionate rates of incarceration of Indigenous youth, the treatment of people of color in the Melbourne lockdown towers, the media being divisive about Asians and people from non-English speaking backgrounds in terms of COVID responses. All of these moments have accelerated senior people in private and public sectors saying no to racism and acknowledging the benefits of multiculturalism. We have had many different conversations since 2017. At least people are now in a dialogue around race, around gender. But here's my critique. They just want to get familiar and learn, but not act yet. And the cynic in me thinks that this acknowledgement is not enough. Here's why. The Scanlon Foundation Social Cohesion Report that got released this year, at the start of the year, revealed that while 84% of respondents agreed that multiculturalism has been good for Australia, 37% of respondents held a negative attitude towards Muslims. 47% had negative feelings towards Chinese Australians. 49% of respondents said they had a very negative or somewhat negative feeling towards people of Iraqi and Sudanese backgrounds. These are men or women who might very well be a woman of color's leader. I challenge you, the acknowledgement is not enough. These sentiments exist in your workplace. Walk in our shoes. If you are still not convinced, let me showcase why we need to act using a key statistic from Chief Executive Women's report on increasing male engagement. While 3 out of 4 Australian men supported gender equality, most of the same cohort of men didn't work actively to identify, to hire, to advance, and to support women in their workplaces. Acknowledgement is not enough. We need deliberate action. Potentially, the gender movement in Australia included men too late in the piece, and this is potentially why men report not being active. Our work has always been about including Anglo and European men and women in senior roles in solving for women of color in leadership. So this is my ask of you. If you represent this demographic, what are you actively doing to advance women of color? Are you working at understanding whether those negative comments and sentiments exist in your workplace? Are you working to break them down? We need your acknowledgement and your action. Intersectional feminism now in Australia is the challenge of our International Women's Day conversations today and for gender equality action plans for all women. I can see the subtle shift. In the 7 speaking engagements I've had for International Women's Day, 6 of them have never had a woman of color as their keynote. Why? And I wonder what will happen next. Of course, knowing me, I will definitely follow up. More broadly, what I hope happens next for all of us in this room is that we work together to solve for the inclusion of women in color in our talent pipelines and open up the pathway to leadership. Let us drive the change with you. Our paths are very different to the other women in the executive and leader roles today. It starts with walking in our shoes first. Thank you.
I'm going to get you to come back up here. Thank you so much, Div. That was absolutely fabulous. Could I now please invite both Amanda and Sharman to join Div and myself up here to begin the Q&A session, please. Just give us a moment to arrange ourselves.
Any particular order?
No, wherever you would like to be is totally fine.
Bucket chairs are comfortable.
That's all ladies need.
I know.
Get the bar stool.
I know they're the worst.
Okay, we are settling in here, and thank you to those who have already sent their questions forward. A little bit sorry to this section, I've slightly got my back to you, so forgive me, I'll make it up to you all later. Thank you to the three of you. Thank you for, I think, some of the most meaningful and engaged addresses that I have seen, and to cover the range of issues that you did at this particular time and to coalesce them in this way for this audience. On behalf of us all, thank you. Please join me in a joint thanks. What is incredible about this room is that, of course, we address many terrifically accomplished people, but we also address the next generation who are coming through, who are emerging into their careers, and they are on the cusp of determining, you know, what kind of leader they're going to be, what kind of contribution that they are going to make. If I can turn first to you, Amanda, and you think about where you were have been working at that intersection of women's leadership and the climate emergency, what advice do you give, in particular, you know, young women in the room today facing the enormity of the climate emergency and what their contribution might be?
It's a good question. I think the first thing is don't underestimate yourself. I think that we set up limitations for ourselves based on our insecurities or based on what we think the world is looking for, or a whole host of other things. But if we are focused on the impact that we want to create and are driven by the impact, I think we can focus on how much we can possibly do and just test it. I often say to young women, you know, if you're in your sort of early 20s and or early to late 20s and you're thinking about what you want to do with your career, now's the time to take risks. We live at an enormously privileged point in time where the actions of our lives have the potential to make enormous difference to the lives of millions and millions of people that come after us. So if there was ever going to be a time in human history to really make your life count, it's now. So take risks.
Div, you're looking at an audience that I think is probably packed to the gunnels of allies and advocates in relation to what you have raised. They are sitting there, they recognise it is their responsibility, it is not someone else's responsibility. They're going to leave here today and they're going to head back into their workplaces and into their areas of influence. What are you going to ask them to do? You've got them. What's your specific call to them? What can they do?
This is on. It is. Well, if you were listening keenly to my keynote, I really want you to identify where those culturally diverse women sit in your business. That is the key to understanding the change that you need to make. And I challenge you to, just like with the gender movement, we had targets, we need some measurable targets to pull up women like me, women that I've brought with me today, because there isn't going to be a natural progression. And it also fills me with rage when I hear that, oh, migrants are so resilient, or when people hear me speak, they go, oh, you'll get there, you'll get wherever you want to go. I'm not the typical cowed women that you're going to see there are many, many women who are doubting their confidence, doubting their competence. They don't have a strong enough voice. I couldn't do this when I was in my corporate workplace. I can do it now because I'm an entrepreneur. And I own my own brand and I can say what I like. But there's many women that can't say what I can say, so I'm doing it for them. But it does need you to find those women and consider what you need to do to open up the pathways to leadership. Otherwise, our leadership will look exactly the same as it has in the last 10 years. We've had a little bit of spotlight on cultural diversity, and that hasn't moved the needle, not one bit, for culturally diverse women. So find them first, and then follow my steps to actually have a really authentic conversation. But first find them and set a target of what you'd like to see.
Sharman, we've been sent a question in here from Mandy, and I'm sorry, Mandy, I don't know whether you're in the room or you're on the live stream, but thank you very much. And she has said, I'm concerned about the lack of inspiring male role models in the public domain for my teenage son, as witnessed this week. What role can we play, and what role in particular can universities play in relation to shifting this?
The business of role models, of course, are critical in young people's lives. And whether you're a man or a woman, right now, I have to say, in terms of the dilemma we're confronting, where are the men in Parliament standing up and saying, we say enough now? Rather, we're hearing, nothing to see here, he shouldn't stand down, the police have said there is no capacity to pursue this matter because the woman's dead. And I'm speaking about our Treasurer, our Victorian Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, a great bloke, I know him well. But there was nothing in his statement of concern for the woman who was alleging the rape when she was 16. You know, it wasn't nuanced or couched in terms that I think a young man or a young woman or anyone for that matter could say, oh, Josh, you really have empathy and sympathy and understanding for the dilemma, but you're identifying that there's a problem with this particular police case because the woman can no longer be asked to give her evidence. You know, it was the way things are couched. We referred to Scott Morrison, I think it was you, man, referring to the fact that he said, oh, I haven't read the brief. You know, I didn't need to read the brief because my minister told me nothing to see here, so why would I read the brief? You know, so these as role models, men role models, simply reinforce the notion that in Parliament, men command the heights. They're in control. They're going to stay in control. Nothing to see here. So I can imagine this person's young son perhaps wondering, so they're not going to find that leadership role modelling in this current dilemma in Parliament. Even if you look at the opposition, forgive me, Anna, for mentioning Labor Party, we haven't had much engagement because there are bodies buried there too, as there are right across Parliament. So this is difficulty. Often we reach for sportsmen in Australia, don't we? We say, we're our footy heroes, let's have them trotted out to tell our young people how to behave. We've got suggestions that schools should up their curriculum and teaching about consent and understanding coercion and so on. In other words, parents have abrogated their responsibility to teach their young kids or don't know how or whatever, so now schools should start teaching young people about when no means no and respect for women and all of that. And yet teachers are saying, oh, we don't know how to do that. We've already got a full curriculum. Don't turn to us, please, to take over this dilemma in our society. So we're in a very troubled and difficult time. And I think in terms of young people and role modelling, the media has an incredibly important role. Men and women of the media to be fair and just and to not just have the 24-hour news cycle of headlines which are titillating, but there's no substance behind them. We've got to have a better informed media giving us real information. But we've got, as I sort of said before, we've got to have every man and woman saying to themselves, what part do I play in this? I can't just simply be shocked and dismayed and then get on with it. What responsibility am I going to take for Australia's future? Do I have the capacity to run for Parliament myself? Do I have a capacity to support someone else to do that? when I ran for Parliament, I only had 3 months to campaign. I had no money from my party because I wasn't meant to win. I couldn't win. So I had $7,000 only from the Liberal Party to buy the how to vote cards. There were no Liberal people, no Liberal Party members in the seat of Murray, right? Because it was the National Party's strongest seat. I was told, you can't win, dear. You don't even have to go from Melbourne up to the electorate. We don't expect you to. We just want your name on the how to vote card. Don't invite any John Howard, who was a shadow leader at the time, don't invite any of them to come and help with your campaign. You'll be distracting them from the real business of beating Labor because you're just contesting the Nat. You're on your own. Don't worry about it. You're not going to win. You can't man the 112 booths in the electorate because you've got no party members. Well, I said, yep, I'll do it. I'll run. They asked me to run. There was no pre-selection because there was no branches to have pre-selection. I said, yeah, I'll give it a run and I'll win. And they said, let me remind you again, dear, if you spent a cent on behalf of the Liberal Party, you'll repay it because we're not... So I won. Yeah. Despite Labor also preferencing the Nat. And so it's possible to do. It is possible to do. And I defied my party often through my parliamentary career because it's about integrity. Every Australian has to say to themselves, what part do I play in our great nation, including women of colour and those who support diversity and inclusion in our society? What part do I play to make a better country? And how am I going to model my concern for this country to my children? And then we'll be a better place. And it's going to be hard.
So, of course, one of the things that has often dampened momentum is the sense that somehow that is a problem there. It is something peculiar to Parliament that has generated what has occurred this week. It is something peculiar to a particularly misinformed or uneducated workplace that stops it from being inclusive. It's some kind of conservative, sceptic position in relation to how serious we understand climate change. We've often dulled our momentum towards progress because we've thought there's something particular going on rather than something systemic, something general, something that affects all of society. So right now we're at a crossroads, of course, where we can choose to see this as something particular or something that impacts everyone. So everyone's heading back, well, perhaps to their home Zoom screens or back perhaps into the office, I'm not sure. Wherever we're going today in terms of our field of influence, and I'm just conscious of the time here, how do we make sure that we don't leave this moment as belonging somewhere else, as to be tidied up somewhere else? How do we go back and how do we check where we are, what we do from here, and how we maintain that momentum? I'll start with you, Amanda.
I think it's about feeling uncomfortable. If you're feeling comfortable, you're probably not doing enough. And I think that's what Div has said to us, is that we as white people have unconscious bias. I thought a lot of the comments that she mentioned were very revealing of that level of unconscious bias. And she's put a challenge to us to say, go and listen to women of colour and walk in their shoes. And that is an uncomfortable place inherently if we're really listening. And so that is a place we need to be uncomfortable. If we're really backing up people like Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins, that may be an uncomfortable place to be. So I think if we're feeling in our workplaces or in our general lives that everything's a bit easy, that shows that we're not doing enough. The test is, this year, how many times did I feel like I was stepping outside of my comfort zone to challenge?
Div?
It's a good segue into what I'm going to say. I'd say two things. Find the truth and then hold yourself accountable to what you're going to do about it. Because I think a lot of our problems, whether it's from climate change to gender equality, to any truth that makes us feel uncomfortable, we don't lean into it. So you've got to go after the truth. And the truth from a gender perspective is told by women. It's not told by someone else who tells a woman that you've probably got it wrong, or maybe you there's more context or nuance. Let's find out about the environment. The truth needs to be heard, and then you've got to hold yourself accountable to what you do next. And I think all of us have a sphere of influence to act, create one and act within it. No act is too small, so start somewhere.
Thanks. And Sharman?
I think we've gone through a generation recently which was very strong on knowing your rights. Know what your human rights are, what your rights are in the workplace and so on. That was a good thing. But we were a bit light on what's your responsibility. With rights comes responsibility. And in Australia in particular, I'm often shocked. You go into a school and the kids talk about their rights, to push back if the teacher's demanding something or whatever. But I think we've got to, in Australia, acknowledge, and it's happening more and more now, that our country is in crisis with the climate change impacts of fire, drought, heavier rain inundation in some places. We've seen the case of America where a populist leader can literally capture the governance of that country and destroy a democracy in terms of its fairness and equity and just behaviour. So it can happen in the greatest country on earth, USA, which was our, this is the golden light in terms of inclusion and fair go. So I think we've got to, in our country, be kind, be informed, look for allies, like-mindeds. And they, for women, include men who are good men. As a feminist, we've got to make sure that people understand feminism means equality, equity. It doesn't mean man-hating, it means equality. And we've got to make sure that people know, for example, with the Parliament, we're not just talking about, we want to see 50-50 men and women because it's going to be looking more like Australia. 50% of Australians are women, so we want it to look more like, we want more women of colour or more Indigenous because it's going to look more like Australia. We've got to be saying to people, but with more women in Parliament or as CEOs of INGOs or NGOs or in the public sector, with women there, we actually have a better outcome. We actually produce a more safe, secure, just society. There's actually good things. We've got all that research which says that when you have more women on the board, 30% plus, the bottom line improves for the shareholder. We've got all that data. So we've got to have Australians understand we're not just a country that has been lucky, and we've had a few odd fires now, but it won't happen again. We've got to think hard about the crisis of our low-paid, vastly, mostly women workforce who can't look after our elderly in care. I mean, I know we're all shocked at the Royal Commission into Aged Care recently. My dad's 97. At the moment, we're trying to look after him in our own family. The people who are in aged care, they're women, they're paid below the minimum wage, and they have 3 jobs to keep the show going, and they're mostly women of colour. We've got to be aware of that. So we become informed. We have rights, we have responsibilities as Australians, and we've got to find our allies, get informed, and then we've got to become active, proactive, take on the tasks ourselves. So at the risk of repeating endlessly, in Parliament we used to be told, say it, this is from our party, say it again and again until they want to vomit, because I've heard it so often, but by then they'll started to believe it. Right? So I'm saying it again and again. Think about our own parliamentary democracy, which at the moment is regarded in contempt by the majority of Australians, which is very bad for a parliamentary democracy going forward. And think you personally about yourself or someone you know supporting them to replace the current incumbents. The men in their R.M. Williams with the pale males in suits, and the women who have to behave like that to be advanced, they have to be replaced because I suspect they can't be converted. And just as a final word, can I read out a roll of honour? If we don't start to take on the governance changes that are needed in this country, we're going to see good women walk away. I'm talking about Kelly O'Dwyer, Kate Ellis, Julia Bank, Anna Burke maybe, and Nicola Roxon, Nicole Flint. They are just part of the role of women who did get into Parliament but who walked away. They said, we can't hack it anymore. We got kids. A lot of them said, we got kids. We can't hack it anymore. This is what's going to happen unless we change the story, change the incumbency, change the masculine tropes which are reinforcing the status quo.
I want to thank you all. This, as I said at the beginning, has been a really fraught period. The way that you have brought your experiences to this moment and enabled our audience to see their way into this moment, and most importantly, their contribution to how we hold this and progress this, because right now, this can't be a moment that we let slip. This has to be a moment that we go forward from. And I think the leadership from you all and the contribution from you all is absolutely inspiring. And we are so proud of you all as a Monash alum, and we are so grateful for your time here this morning. Please join me in thanking our panellists. We are now going to very elegantly exit the stage while my good friend and colleague, Professor Simon Wilkie, the Dean of the Business School, comes up to close out our event this morning. Thank you again.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
So thanks, Sharon. Hi, everybody. I just want to first of all thank everybody for attending this event. Thanks for your time and your generosity. This has been truly wonderful. As was pointed out, this is the first time since a year ago that we've actually been able to meet in person and have a public event. So it's doubly important, I think, not just the nature of the event, but the fact that we get to do this in person, and I think particularly meaningful. I just want to also start by thanking all of our speakers, Amanda, Div, Sharman. This was, for me, truly humbling. I'm very privileged to have been in the audience today and hear those speeches. And I think, just echoing where Sharon ended the last panel, what we want to do is facilitate moving forward on this agenda. And I think I can speak for my fellow deans. We're going to do what we can, not just internally, but to facilitate this group moving forward. It's not about minuscule changes. It's not about changing and people in roles and promoting things, or promoting ideas or promoting people. It has to be structural. I would go further. I would say it has to be, we need new institutions, we need new cultural norms, and we need, as a society, to push forward and think about the society we want to be as we come out of not just this pandemic, but the profound economic changes that the world is going through. We have a chance to remake society. Let's think about what we want it to look like, and let's have the brain power in this room start facilitating the positive conversation and accelerating the positive conversation of not just small changes, but where we want to really get to. And we are a hell of a long way from that. I really feel that it's not my role to talk about any of my personal experiences here, but I'm going to abuse my self-imposed rule and talk about one. Back in 2002, 2003, I was privileged to serve as the chief economist of the United States Federal Communications Commission. This is the highest role in US government that you can get to without a Senate confirmation. So that was as high as I could possibly go, for the obvious reasons. My boss was Michael Powell, who is African American. His cabinet, when we met on Friday mornings to discuss strategy, and just to remind everybody, this is the George W. Bush Republican administration. I was the only straight white male in the room. That was the leadership team of a Republican administration in 2002 that oversaw an industry roughly the size of the Australian economy. We have a hell of a long way to go here. And we've gone a long way backwards, I think. I mean, definitely the US has gone horrendously backwards. So it's not just a matter of, moving forward, it's a matter of stopping things going worse. So I don't want to leave on a downer note, but I actually think we can do it. I actually think this is a great opportunity for us all to collectively work out what does it look like, not just incremental changes, but what the new organizational structures, what the new cultural norms look like, and push onwards and upwards. And I am humbled and so privileged to have been in this room today. I want to profoundly thank each and every one of you. Thank you.